1.
Good morning, everybody. It is Monday, September 16th. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. This is our 5th work session to review the Building Energy Performance Standards regulations, and that is the only topic on our agenda today. Ever since the regulations for this really important law came over to the Council earlier this year, we've had a number of conversations with stakeholders and interested parties about how to implement building energy and performance standards, recognizing that 52% of our carbon emissions in Montgomery County come from our physical infrastructure, our buildings, and if we are to meet our goal of eliminating carbon emissions by the year 2035, we need to reduce and eliminate those from our largest sector. Over the last number of months, we've had conversations with our hospitals, with our life sciences and biotech sector, with affordable housing providers, with developers and representatives of multifamily housing, which includes the developers, rental market agents, and also HOAs and co-op members as well. As we've heard throughout these conversations, there is unanimous support for making our infrastructure green. But there are some concerns that folks have, particularly property owners, in making sure that they are able to meet the site energy intensity unit targets and make sure that the alternative compliance process will work. One other incredibly important component of this conversation is making sure that it is economically feasible to make these investments and changes. And so we have focused a lot of attention on those realities, figuring out how we can make this work, because we have to make this work. There is no question about that. The only question is how we find the funding to do so, and also looking to work with our state partners and see what the state regulations are and try to marry them as closely as possible so there is no confusion or ambiguity. I also just want to state in my personal capacity that I have been engaged in a lot of conversations about the funding aspect and working to see if we could get our green bank to become a bondable agent, to be able to multiply the funding that they have in order to provide support to everybody who wants to make these upgrades. We know that the financial constraints are real. We've heard everybody loud and clear, but we are working diligently to make that possible. That's the backdrop for today's conversation, which is all about the financing, probably the most critical aspect of this work. And so I'd like to invite up to the table a number of guests to speak with us about local, state, and federal funding opportunities that are available. Steve Morrell from the Montgomery County Green Bank, if you want to come up, Steve, I see you right over here, the CEO. Julie Wolfington, Certified Energy Manager, Energy and Sustainability Leader from Boland. Julie's not here yet. She might be downstairs. So, Scott Falvey, who's a Senior Energy Program Manager, who is joining us on Zoom. We see you, Scott. Eric Hoffman, welcome back to the building. Eric, who's now Director of Programs with the Maryland Energy Administration. Rebecca Price, Clean Energy Hub Policy Manager from MEA. And joining us at 10 o'clock because of a prior commitment will be a former member of this committee, of this council, Hans Raymer, who is now a senior consultant with the U.S. Department of Energy Loans Program. And as always, joining us for all of these conversations are our DEP staff. Thank you for being present at all of these conversations, taking diligent notes so that we can all be on the same page at their conclusion. Colleagues, any comments? We're good? Mr. Olchenko, anything I forgot to add?
Just a couple process points. We do have another panel discussion next week We've invited members of the faith community to come in with regard to issues those properties may have or concerns and opportunities there. And also, the council will be considering an extension of the deadline for the regulation, which we had done an extension to the end of this month, but based on the fact that we're still having these discussions and will not be able to wrap it up by the end of the month, we will have an extension before the council for the regulation to give us more time. So that folks will see that on the agenda for the full council. With that, I suggest we just turn it over to our panelists.
Yep, and thank you for noting tomorrow's agenda. There will be an item on the consent calendar extending this conversation through at least the end of February of next year, so that we have additional time to speak with stakeholders and figure out this financial component. And it seems like Ms. Wolfington has joined us. Thank you. No, it's okay. There's another conversation on the third floor, so we're up here on the 7th. But thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Morrell, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Committee Chair Glass, thank you for having me here today. My name is Stephen Morrell. I'm the CEO of the Montgomery County Green Bank. Very pleased to be here today in support of BEPS and the proposed regulations that are in front of the council presently. As you know full well, we're an independent nonprofit financial intermediary dedicated towards catalyzing investment in clean energy, energy efficiency, climate resilience. And I would say that we've been relatively successful in being able to do that. In FY24, we took in $18.1 million from the energy tax, and we closed over $105 million in project investment. The reason that works, the reason that we can crowd in that private investment, is because there certainly does exist an economic value proposition to investing in energy efficiency and clean energy. And that's that we underwrite to savings, meaning that savings are a repayment mechanism that we can then tout to the private sector to crowd them in and have them invest. And that's an interesting fact for a couple different reasons. One, because there is an economic value proposition, that means that there's a financial strategy to be able to invest in energy efficiency and clean energy with no money up front and to have a net positive gain in the long run. Meaning that you can take out a loan to pay for the measures that you would need to become compliant with the BEPS law, and the operational savings that you would get from those measures could be greater than the debt service that you would owe. It's a net positive activity, and that's how we've been able to crowd in investment. And for that reason, that's why we're very supportive of BEPS and the proposed regulations at hand. This is true of any sector. Multifamily, in fact, is 53% of our portfolio right now. We've worked a lot in other sectors as well that traditionally have been underserved or challenged to get to in the financing markets, nonprofits, common ownership communities. Just to give you an example, we had a great project last year, actually 2 years ago now, 2 fiscal years ago, of a condo in Chevy Chase. It was 89,000 square feet, built in 1962. 70 households, 60 of which were LMI, where we were able to conduct a $1.2 million project in conjunction with some private sector partners that were also offering a loan, and we provided a loan of 10 years with a 30-year amortization. The measures that they were able to complete with that made a significant increase in their EUI score. Again, at the time that we were doing this, there wasn't anything about where they would fall relative to the regulations, but it was an important fact that they were able to make that increase. Particularly as we look at the loan of 10 years with a 30-year amortization, the amortization fits well with what you were looking at in terms of the regulation of what is economically feasible. And I'm happy to dive into a little more of that on the Q&A. I know this is a work session, so I want to just be here and available to answer your questions. Thank you.
Just on that point, if you could elaborate a little bit more about the Chevy Chase project up front.
Yes, absolutely. So this was a project where the crux of the energy efficiency measures that they were conducting were relative to their heating and cooling, that they made a significant upgrade there to an energy efficient system that they previously didn't have. They were looking at all together on the combined projects, some of which the items had great payback, some of which didn't, a 22.4-year simple payback. And so that sounds like a lot for anybody that's taking a look at getting into a loan. But whenever we could provide a loan with a 30-year amortization, which the market was perfectly comfortable joining in at, then you have a longer term than the payback, and you'll get that net positive aspect. So they had no upfront money that they had to put in. They didn't have to increase their assessments in order to pay for this project. And in the long run, then they'll be able to pay the debt service out of those savings. This was an interest rate of 5.34%, but as you get to that positive payback and the longer term that you go, the interest rate is actually relatively irrelevant. You could go to 10%, 20%, hopefully not. But the point is that as the interest rate changes, that's not as relevant as the longer term that you can go. So that was a success that we were able to work with a longstanding bank in the district that provided assistance to this co-op.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Morrell, for that. I know we'll have more questions at the conclusion of our panel. Turn it over to Ms. Wellington, if you could talk with us about the energy and sustainability work at Boland. Sure. Yes, please.
Okay. My name is Julie Wolfington. I'm the energy and sustainability leader for a leading HVAC and energy services company here in the county. I also live in the county. I'm an engineer and I'm a certified energy manager. So for my company, in addition to managing our own internal sustainability program, I also lead a team of energy and HVAC engineers, and our job is to remotely monitor hundreds of commercial buildings in the DMV area, monitor their HVAC systems. And our job is really to find all of the energy and operational gremlins, is what I call them, but issues lurking in those systems, and report back to the owners on how to fix them. So that's what we do. So I'm talking about things ranging from, chillers, short cycling, to equipment, schedule overrides, things like that. So, but here's the problem. So I've been doing this for a while. So despite building owners paying us to do this, the majority of building owners ignore our recommendations and they don't fix a lot of the issues. They'll fix the chiller short cycling, but the energy-related issues are largely ignored, even when they're free to do. So, but here's the thing, this is not because building owners are lazy or they hate the environment. This is generally because they have a facility staff that is running around putting out fires, changing light bulbs, etc., and fixing something that's not necessarily broken. It's just inefficient, gets really, really low on that priority list. So, or it might be because they have a set budget for utilities, and as long as you don't go over that, nobody really says a lot. So again, it's kind of a matter of priority. So, and another reason is because buildings are really complex, and it's not usually core to a business owner's mission, right? It's just kind of like something that they have to deal with. So, and a company like ours will give them a recommendation, and it's generally full of technical information and financial information that we're really proud of, but they look at it and they go, oh, okay, let's deal with that later. So I think BEPS will be effective because the carrot method has not worked. I've been doing this for 25 years. The carrot method rarely works. It does occasion. So utility incentives and just the simple nature of these energy efficiency jobs is they have a payback, right? You're saving money, saving energy, saving money. But that has not largely worked. So that's why I'm a big fan of BEPS, because I think that the stick method will. So I think that it will require people to start paying attention. We just need them to pay attention, right? So when they pay attention, they will see that they're wasting energy and therefore wasting money, and hopefully want to do something about it. So, what we need to help building owners to understand is that they're not getting any value spending more money on their utility bill than they need to. Their lights are not shining brighter, their 72-degree air is not more comfortable, right? They're just spending more and not getting that benefit. They're spending their profits and they're not getting that benefit. So I guess that's what puzzles me about people's hesitation about BEPS, is that we're really asking people to stop wasting money on energy. And we see it very granularly every day as we remotely monitor these buildings live, okay? So most buildings that are inefficient, they're not that way. Here's the thing. I get that building owners are hesitant. They don't want to spend money. But most buildings that are inefficient are not that way because they have a bunch of old stuff that needs to be replaced. The majority of buildings that we see are inefficient because no one's paying attention. So the HVAC equipment, it's left on 24/7. Maybe it had a schedule, but then it was overridden because there was a holiday or so-and-so got upset because they wanted their office a certain temperature or whatever. Anyway, so maybe there's an outdoor, I wasn't being specific in that. But other like minor mechanical issues, like an outdoor air damper being stuck open, can cost thousands of dollars in energy waste. An outside air sensor being miscalibrated can completely disable an economizer function that can cost thousands of dollars in energy waste. So these are the types of things that we see every day. It costs nothing to turn a piece of equipment off. Well, unless you don't know how to do it and you need to pay somebody to do it. But it should cost nothing to turn a piece of equipment off. It costs about $100 for a new outside air sensor. So for the first 20 years of my career, I developed HVAC repair projects and sold maintenance agreements and things like that. And what I figured out pretty quickly is that healthy HVAC systems that are properly controlled are generally very energy efficient, even if they're old, right? But someone has to pay attention, and they have to keep paying attention to ensure that these buildings stay tuned, is kind of what we call them. Because without attention, without somebody paying attention, they don't stay tuned. They fall off the wagon pretty quickly. And then when it's time to replace the HVAC equipment, we see this all the time. People are like, well, just replace it, it broke, whatever, replace like for like. And so even though there are utility incentives out there that say, just buy something this much more efficient, you know, a lot of people don't know about that. And so they replace like for like. And even like for like nowadays is going to be marginally more efficient. But the building owner could save a ton of money over the next 20 years if they just buy something that's more efficient and that is paid for with utility incentives. But again, people aren't paying attention, not everyone, but a lot of building owners are very busy running their business, and I can appreciate that. One other thing that I was thinking on the way here, if I can have one more minute, is that okay? The issue of equity. So I've been in hundreds of buildings throughout my career. A couple of years ago, in particular, I went into one. It was a high-rise, low-income multifamily in the county. This mechanical equipment was in complete disrepair. It was like 40 years old. The control system was completely not functioning. That equipment, when it would go down, inevitably, in August, of course, is when the chiller is going to go down. They would go for weeks. This chiller was like obsolete. Getting repair parts was like an act of Congress, and so it would take weeks sometimes. So you see low-income multifamily residents in a high-rise, many of them elderly, with no air conditioning for weeks, sometimes months. So one thing we've talked a lot about, or I've heard a lot about, is the BPIPs. And they say, okay, well, let's give the low-income buildings more time to comply. I would strongly encourage you to not do that, actually, because if a building has been properly tuned, okay, and it is still insanely inefficient, so this building in particular, they just ran everything all the time because they were scared if they turned it off, it wasn't going to turn back on, okay? So it was really inefficient. So if it's been tuned and it's still really, really inefficient, that means probably the mechanical systems are an absolute mess. And for healthy air for the residents, it's imperative that these systems get replaced. So I actually think it's not equitable. It's equitable to give them healthy air. So a healthy building is generally very energy efficient, and those two go really well together. So that was just a thought on my drive over.
No,
Thanks.
Appreciate that perspective. We'll come back. I got questions about carrots and sticks. So, so thank you for that. Joining us virtually now is Mr. Scott Falvey, who is with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. So, Mr. Falvey, welcome. You're on.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for having me. My department is Housing and Building Energy Programs. We're a division of CDA, Community Development Agency, and the Department of Housing and Community Development. So there's a whole bunch of, alphabet soup there for you. So With our programs, right now we have two programs that really are better suited to deal with kind of the BEPS issues. Overall, since 2012, Housing and Building Energy Programs has provided, actually has touched about 87,000 households, and we've provided benefit funding of about $697 million. And what that means is, overall, we've saved Maryland constituents, about $697 million in energy costs, and roughly getting 39,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions, not produced and put into the environment. So those are some pretty substantial benefits that the department has provided over the years, and we're looking forward to being able to provide future benefits as well. Right now, two of the primary funding sources that we have for helping with BEPS and decarbonization and greenhouse gas reductions are the MIHA and Power funds. These funds are paid for through the utilities, the participating utilities of Empower, through the ratepayer surcharges. Currently, this program is actually an energy saving program, but starting in 2025, the program transitions over to a greenhouse gas reduction program, which will certainly help properties that need to achieve BEPS, help to get there. Not that it's the solution, but it's a step in the right direction. And the other program is our greenhouse gas reduction program, GHGRP. The GHGRP is specific to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Under the MIHA and Power program, we're currently providing roughly about $5,000 per unit in program benefits. And in the GHGRP program, we're providing, the maximum is $15,000 per unit with a project cap of $1,250,000 per unit. Our programs are specifically for low-income properties and affordable properties. They need to meet income eligibility for 80% of AMI. Under the Empower program, the projects have to have a 5-year affordability agreement in place in order to be eligible for funding. And under the GHGRP, those properties need to have, I'll back up a little bit, sorry. Under Empower, 20% of the units have to have 80% AMI, and there's a 5-year affordability restriction on those properties. And then under the GHGRP, it's 51% of the units must have 80% AMI or less, and the affordability requirements are for 15 years. The GHGRP, as I said earlier, is specific to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the program will provide funds really for any cost that a project is likely to incur in order to make the transition from fossil fuels over to electric. That includes engineering fees, permit fees, any actual construction, whether it's having to, dig trenches to install conduit, over, to doing upgraded electric panels in the property, new circuits, and then also the equipment that gets installed. We will also help cover properties that, the cost that it takes for properties to have the utility service upgraded, so the heavy ups. So one of the challenges that we've actually found with the GHGRP is, some of these properties that are very heavily fossil fuel, if they switch to electric, they also need to have their utility service upgraded, at the street to the property. And that can be a very costly expense. and it can also take a lot of time. So I think, when we're considering timeframes for when properties need to comply with any type of BEPS, some of these properties that need to have that utility service upgraded, almost by default, it's going to take them, 6 months to a year, even just to get the permitting process done with the utility company. Some utility companies are better than others. I can't speak to, which one is which, but that is, a challenge that we're seeing in the program right now. Something to consider, as you're looking at trying to have properties meet compliance requirements, because that is definitely something that we're already running into under that program. And then another challenge that we currently have is under the GHGRP, which is actually funded through state funds, we can only issue those funds as grants. And sometimes these properties, if they're tax credit properties or if they have other financing institutions that are funding their properties, they can't take grants on. It affects their underwriting ability and their basis. And so some properties can't take grants. We're actually considering, whether we can have a legislative modification to provide those funds as loans as well, so that we can actually get these funds into really any type of funding source or funding setup that the properties require. So I think those are kind of the primary funding sources available through DHCD, and really just a high level of how a property would go about getting funds. They would do an application with the state. The application is available online. They'd have to do an energy audit to identify measures that would be appropriate for either energy saving and or for greenhouse gas reductions. And then they would submit a funding request. And then my team would do a review of the application, review of the funding request. We'd then determine how much funding would be available for the property or what's appropriate for the property based on their scope of work. We'd have that conversation with the property owners, and we would actually negotiate, what is actually the proper scope of work and funding for that specific project. We'd then go through the loan and the grant agreement process. We'd have those reviewed by our legal team, and then we'd get those executed. And the affordability agreements would also be put in place, where applicable. There are some properties that come through that already have affordability restrictions, regulatory agreements. We don't require additional ones as long as they meet the same timeframes that we require for our program funds. And then construction would begin on the property. And the way the programs work is we don't issue the funds up front. So once a property is approved for funding, we issue the funds based on work that's completed. And so the construction would begin, the owner would go out there and do the work on the property. They would submit a requisition to the department for the work that's been completed and installed. We would have a project manager go out to the project, review the work compared to the requisition that's being presented. And then once the work has been approved, then the funds on that requisition are then issued to the property. And once the whole project is complete, we go back, we do the final inspection on the final requisition and, issue any funds that are due for that final requisition. And that's kind of the process for getting funding, through the DHCD programs. And I'm not here to speak on policy. DHCD may have its own feelings on, the policy for BEPS, but from a program perspective, our job is to try to help property owners get funding to achieve some of these, very difficult standards that they have to achieve, in order to be compliant with BEPS, whether it's with any county or at the state level. So we're here to try to get funding, to these projects to make it more affordable, wherever we can. So I'm here if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Falvey. We were all taking notes, so be prepared for a question or two when we conclude the panel. Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.
Now I'll turn it over to your partner in state government, Mr. Kaufman, who used to be with county government.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Eric Kaufman, Division Director, Energy Programs for the Maryland Energy Administration. I'm joined here by my colleague, Rebecca Price, our Clean Buildings Hub Coordinator. And for those not familiar with the Maryland Energy Administration, we're your state energy office. And in that role, we are focused on education, technical assistance, and in many cases, financial support for innovative and exemplary projects that can help move the needle towards our state greenhouse gas and energy goals. And with that, I will pass it over to Rebecca, who will lead the presentation.
You want to turn your mic on?
Thank you. I've never done that before.
Thank you, council members, for inviting me here today. Kind of a full circle moment. I am from Montgomery County, just down the road in Rockville, or in Potomac. Like Eric said, my name is Rebecca Price, and I'm an employee with the Maryland Energy Administration. I'll henceforth refer to as MEA. My comments were already quite short compared to the others, and now that Eric did the MEA stump speech, it'll be even shorter. But I'm sort of here today, so I think a lot of the folks who are invited actually give out money. And yes, as you know, MEA does give out money. That's under Eric's branch. But I'm sort of here to talk about an indirect initiative we're doing that's indirect, but I still think very important to seeing success with BEPS compliance, both in the county and then across the entire state. So we over at MEA are actually statutorily mandated in the Climate Solutions Now Act to create the Maryland Clean Buildings Hub. It was like the last sentence in the 100-page bill if you read it. And it's an initiative to help building owners understand how to decarbonize, both from like a technical standpoint. So I don't know if you saw me nodding emphatically when Julie was talking about just a lot of the lack of information about, okay, I've benchmarked, now what do I do? What audit do I even go for? And then once I get the audit, how do I create a roadmap for the next 15 years? So there's that part. And then, of course, the part that we're here today is financially. So as I've been speaking with building owners for the last year, there's so many options, and there's not a lot of understanding on how those options all interplay together. How can I stack them, which is a word I think we're hearing so much with the passage of the IRA. How do I braid them? How do I, insert adjective there, or verb rather. So really, we want to reduce what I call the administrative burden on buildings with this initiative, that, they don't even know where to start. And this idea of a hub is actually borrowed from other jurisdictions that have enacted similar building performance standards. Notably, our neighbors in DC, they have the Building Innovation Hub that is staffed by a group called IMT. And then in New York City, when they passed Local Law 97, they also stood up a hub. Their hub is generously funded at $10 million a year, and they can do so much great work with that, like one-on-one technical assistance with buildings. So, yeah, when I describe the hub, and the caveat, it is still being built out, but I've started using the phrase first mile of technical assistance to emphasize the fact that we can't, even just being a state agency, we can't, apply on behalf of buildings for funding, but we can help them, like I said, get started. And we may not be the expert in any particular topic, but know who the experts are, and we'll pass them off to those folks. So we're going to rely on a variety of mediums. Eric mentioned education is so key here. So workshops, webinars, cohorts, fact sheets, all the things, just going out into the community. And I kind of just wanted to give one example of how I spend my week. On Friday, I'll be speaking with a hospital association, and I'll give the spiel about why the hub exists, and then I'm going to be plugging the Montgomery County Green Bank. They have the coolest technical assistance program that I am always plugging for folks I talk to in Montgomery County. They'll help subsidize the cost of feasibility studies, audits, et cetera. So that's an example of the type of kind of pass through. And then I'll talk a little bit about energy savings performance contracting, which for hospitals is going to be probably the mechanism which they fund it. So so I brought Eric with me in case you have any specific questions about the types of grants we give out at MEA or just our funding structure in general. I wanted to have the real expert in the room. So thank you.
Well, you did a great job, and I agree with your sentiment that it is overwhelming for a lot of people and don't know where to begin. And I love the terminology "first mile." We spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time talking about last mile, right? This is the T&E committee, so the T part talks about last mile, but the E part will talk about first mile. So, trademarked. There you go. And the last presenter on this panel, someone who knows something about BEPS because he was the lead sponsor of the legislation and a former member of this committee. Councilmember Reamer, it's good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for the invitation. I've never sat on this side of the dais. It's less intimidating than I thought, but maybe that's because you're all so nice and friendly. So, apologize that I am joining at this stage. I have a number of slides that I can walk through, but I don't know if that's the most useful thing to do. I think our state and county partners are, the more important contributors here in terms of near-term work that needs to happen. And it's good to be on this dais with you as well, my friends. The Loan Programs Office is a lending institution inside of the Department of Energy, and we provide long-term financing. And we can finance projects that are helping buildings decarbonize. There are some significant challenges with accessing our financing. Our loans typically start at $100 million and up, and we really just finance the energy-related costs of a building project. So, for example, if you had a building owner who wanted to do a deep retrofit on the building, and in the process of doing the retrofit was replacing outdated kitchen, an outdated kitchen with a modern kitchen and those kinds of things, we're not able to finance those non-energy expenses. We're just able to finance heat pumps and solar and maybe wiring. So we are in dialogue with states primarily, but also counties or local jurisdictions that have BEPS, and they are thinking about how to help the private sector comply. And we, for example, participated in a webinar earlier this year that the White House convened with the Loan Programs Office, and New York participated. And New York described some of their Local Law 97 implementation, their BEPS law implementation. And they've actually released a useful guide about getting Local Law 97 done, it's called. It's a brief report. And they have been able to ascertain what kinds of buildings will be their priority for grants and other rebates that might be available from the state or from the city. And then what the scale of change in the building is likely to be required, what's going to be required, which helps them understand at what point is financing needed for a building, and then what are the economics of financing, and will the cost of financing and making changes in financing them, how does that compare to the cost of paying fines for non-compliance? And what they identified is that for many buildings, there will be a tough choice where non-compliance is actually cheaper than compliance. So you are in the earlier stages of your regulations, and the state is working through the state's regulations. So it isn't really known what the economics of making changes in these buildings is. We do know the state has passed its law with a certain timeline. I believe it's 2030. There's a certain reduction that is required by the state. And so perhaps you could work back from that, but the county's approach is in development. So as you put those policy frameworks in place, and then you kind of work back from there, and you can understand what is the incentive to make these investments. And there are some kinds of buildings where there's access to enough rebates and enough grants that these investments will more than pay for themselves. They will have a lower operating cost than they did prior to beginning their compliance work. There are others where that's not the case. And so, really delving into that and figuring that out. New York shared that they are focusing more at this stage on technical assistance to figure out for various building types what it will cost to comply on their compliance roadmap. So I imagine that's more where the county and the state are at, is really trying to make those assessments in that kind of earlier stage of the journey. But should you seek to provide lower cost financing so that the private sector can have an easier path to comply, it is possible for the Loan Programs Office to be a resource for a portfolio of building projects. Presumably, the state and the county would be working together with the Green Bank. You'll have to figure that out. And we can certainly provide technical support about the financing model as you might proceed. But we would be probably a little later in your timeline of process. There's a lot to do to figure out earlier questions. But the bottom line is, if there were, for example, one way to think about it is who's going to be the borrower, but other states are exploring having a state entity apply to the Loan Programs Office. It could be the county as well, potentially, but apply to the Loan Programs Office to provide a pool of lower cost loans for individual building owners to come and then have a lower cost of capital to make those changes. Now, again, we've got really strong partners here with the County Green Bank and the state agencies, and so this will be something you'll figure out together. But as much as there might be interest in the Loan Programs Office, I don't know if you want to walk me through 25 slides about it. I think probably dialogue is more relevant. So.
Well, appreciate that, and much of the sentiment that you shared had been shared by others as well, particularly regarding what had previously been called the carrot and stick approach of how to fund these and at what point to enforce, essentially. But let's open it up to questions. I have a few, and I'm going to start with Mr. Morell. The top line number that you shared, and that I think is a huge success, is the nearly $18 million that the county invests in the Green Bank, which gets turned into $105 million of investment. Can you talk to us about what that $105 million of investment is, and even more specifically, those investments, how do they currently get us towards these BEPS goals without the goals being codified just yet?
Yeah, could appreciate that quite a bit. And we did take a look at our entire portfolio, some of which was done before we looked at the regulations were proposed. And so we take a GHG reduction or offset approach with kind of the impact metrics that we follow as well. So it became a little bit of a challenge to try and track the hypothetical of what would BEPS compliance look like with our portfolio that we achieved here. But we're talking about the same types of measures that would help achieve BEPS compliance for a property. These are HVAC-related measures, controls, renewable energy, rooftop solar, geothermal power, or geothermal heat, heating and cooling, other types of energy efficiency measures, even some that may have a relatively low payback, but they're expensive. But there is an energy effect to them. So it's really the gamut of the types of activities that would support compliance. I do want to echo one point that's been made a couple different times in terms of figuring information out. One of the biggest lessons that we learned as we engage in starting with our technical assistance program, taking then projects through financing, is that as people learned what the economic value proposition was, they were more excited to move forward. And two, a lot of these properties actually ended up in a pretty good position relative to benchmarking. As they started putting their benchmarking out there, people were very surprised that it was easier for them to get to where they needed to be on bench, or where they were seeing their peers on benchmarking than they ever expected. And we have some analytics that we run as well to try and look at that relative to that property type across the entire country to see where properties lie. And they're always pleasantly surprised. And so I'd like to echo that, that's an important part that A, people need to figure out where they are, and then B, they can figure out that with a relatively low investment, they can make large gains. And that was the other experience that we had with these. And I've been told I can't get too mathy in my description here, but if you imagine a function that comes to an asymptote, like to a limit, there's a little bit of investment that you need to make at the lower end to make big gains. And as you get closer to perfection, which is already above the regulation, then yeah, maybe it's a higher level investment. We're underwriting savings at the end of the day. So the more opportunity for savings there are, then the more opportunity there is for finance. And I think that also hits the equity issue that Julie was talking about. If you think of the worst properties out there, they are the biggest opportunity for savings for these type of investments. Therefore, they're more attractive from the financial standpoint. So I know that gets a little away from your specific question, but the point is that we engage in these type of measures that will help properties comply with BEPS every single day.
Very helpful. Appreciate that. I want to ask Mr. Falvey a question about the state's work. Very interested in knowing more about the 80% AMI and what are the rules and regulations regarding that. And you had talked about these being grants and not loans. So I infer that these are nonprofit housing, right, or affordable housing nonprofit organizations that manage these buildings. But clearly we know there's naturally affordable housing that are owned by private investors or landlords that might qualify for loans. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and if there are any properties that you're aware of in Montgomery County as an example?
Sure. So I guess on the very last point, I don't know of any Montgomery County properties specifically off the top of my head. I'm sure my project manager would know that much better, but we do provide funds for really any type of ownership of the property. So it could be nonprofit, it could be county owned, it could be for profit. The program doesn't differentiate ownership style over one over the other. We don't have restrictions there, so we can provide through the GHGRP program. Again, that's the one that's specific to greenhouse gas reductions. We can provide grants, to any of those types of ownership. Under our Empower program, we can provide grants and loans. So you asked about the 80%. Yes, that the 80%, we follow HUD's 80% as low income. Again, all of the properties that we provide funds for under either of these programs are low-income properties. Under the Empower program, we required regulatory agreements for affordability for probably the first 3 cycles of the Empower program. And last cycle, under the 21 cycle, we actually removed the regulatory agreement requirement and just put that requirement for affordability into the grant agreement. And a big reason why we made that change under Empower was so that a lot of these naturally occurring affordable housing properties could access the Empower program. It's not that they didn't want to, but we were getting, feedback from these properties that they didn't want to have this 5-year regulatory agreement on the property. They didn't want to be forced into having an agreement filed on their land records that this is what they had to do. In some cases, doing that also triggered a fee from their financing institution that it actually made or caused a change in ownership, and that would cause a fee to be incurred by the property, and then it would make it so that it was unaffordable for the property to participate in the program. So under the Empower program, we removed that regulatory agreement requirement for affordability and just put the language in the grant agreement, which is obviously still, a contractual requirement to remain affordable for that period of time. Under the GHGRP program, again, this is a state-funded program, and this program came about through the Climate Solutions Now Act and only allows us to issue grants. And the challenge with issuing grants, as I said earlier, is, some properties just can't take the funds as a grant because it complicates their underwriting and their financing for those properties.
So it's not a tax distinction that I implied, right? Here at the county, when we give grants, they're to 501c3s, but that's a difference that you're referring to, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, I mean, for the way that I'm speaking about it is, a lot of the properties that come through DHCD really for financing, for whether it's acquisition rehab or rehab, when they're doing their underwriting, receiving the funds as a grant affects their ability for financing.
Understood.
And so under the Empower program, we, implemented being able to do loans to bypass that, because in these specific properties, they're better off having the debt on their property than they are having that asset of the grant coming in.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Last question I have right now before I open up to colleagues is for Councilmember Reamer. You had talked about the Department of Energy coming in at a later stage. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure. We are available for loans for these kinds of projects, but you have to have a defined portfolio of projects that you are seeking to finance, and I think that it's not yet clear who wants to borrow money in order to do these projects, and why, and how much. And it's not yet clear how you want to align various other resources that might be available that would affect who's going to borrow money versus the example that we heard where they're actually shifting from grants to loans. So there's a lot of those kinds of issues that you'll work out, and then that will leave you with a clearer sense of how financing will play a role.
Would for that, would the county be someone who an entity that takes out loans, or is it more communities, or?
Well, in the specific case of the Loan Programs Office, I think it's unlikely that the county would be the borrower from us, but there's different ways you could do it. You could create a project vehicle, which would be the applicant to the Loan Programs Office. And then the county could fund a share of that, because we can't fund the whole cost of the portfolio. We're funding just a share of it, maybe 60, 70%, something around there. And then you use that to create this pool of low-cost loans for the individual building projects. If the state were investing in that pool, that would allow us to use non-innovative technologies. So there's a pathway like in that way. The state can also do that. The state could create a vehicle and do the same thing, and then the county can be a big part of that. Individual property owners can do that. I mean, a nonprofit provider of housing could assemble a portfolio of projects, their own, perhaps even other nonprofits. They could assemble across multiple owners portfolio of projects, and they could create that special vehicle, that project vehicle, and they could be the applicant to LPO. So that is something that might actually be earlier in the timeline than the state or the county as an applicant potentially.
I think that's really helpful because in the last few months since we've been having these conversations, there have been communities that have found each other and banded together to share with us their greater concerns, and those bundles have already been formed in some respect, and so being able to encourage further dialogue I think is probably the right path. Yeah.
And then again, it's just when it's clear what the economic requirements are, like in the incentives, I think that's when it's clear what the financing need will be. So I think that's really more what I was saying, is that you're working through all of these issues, and so that the parameters of the program are being finalized. And when that happens, then you'll have a clearer sense of how you'd emphasize financing and for whom.
Very helpful. Colleagues? Councilmember Balcom.
Thanks.
Got it.
Thanks. I'll just follow up on this because I think that this is important. So when you talk about a project and the possibility of different owners coming together, does it have to have a through line? For instance, is it what constitutes a project for the Department of Energy?
Sure. Okay. Keith, perhaps we could show a slide. Great question. So the short answer is, okay, if you could, is there a clicker on this side or? I'll have to. Okay. If you'll scroll through, please. There we go. Okay, so we lend money to a project. A project is a distinct, it is a distinct financing. There's a beginning and an end to it. It could be a single manufacturing facility. It could be a portfolio of smaller installations or essentially smaller projects. There's a through line because they have to be similar enough that we can do the diligence on them as one project. So buildings would typically likely be one project. If you had a portfolio of buildings that all wanted to make similar kinds of changes, heat pumps and solar and EV charging, then those could be bundled together as one large project, and then someone could borrow from the loan programs office in order to lend to those multiple installations. So, and I think it's definitely worth exploring how the Green Bank and county and state and CEC and others can kind of work together in that. But the short answer to your question is there's a through line because a portfolio has to be a portfolio of similar projects for an application, and each application for us will need to be more than $100 million. So for the loan request. And the total size of the project would need to be larger because we're only going to lend to a share of the project. So that could be done potentially at the county level. Certainly a little easier to assemble that kind of portfolio on a statewide level, but it could potentially be done on a county level as well.
Okay, thank you.
And so this slide.
Councilmember Reamer, I'm told your mic is not on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you go.
This slide, that was the best part. This slide shows where a private entity or nonprofit or a consortium of buildings is the borrower from the loan program's office. And the dark blue at the top is the loan program's office loan. The light blue at the bottom is the applicant's equity. They have to come to the table with cash, private equity, other kinds of subordinated capital. And then that green slice is a state agency's investment in the project. We are allowed to provide a loan for a conventional technology project, not an innovative technology, if a state agency is making an investment in that project. So for the county to access LPO's financing for projects in the county, you would presumably need some kind of state participation. And then if you could go to the next slide, Keith. So it's the same thing, except for this is when the state agency is the borrower. State agency or a governmental agency is the borrower. And so we just show that the equity share of that capital was brought in by the state entity.
Great, thanks. I think that's something we can continue to look at. So thank you. Other questions? So the Green Bank, the energy savings funding, the terminology that you lend on savings. So what about projects? And we've heard during different work sessions, some property owners feel like they'll never get the savings that equal the cost. Do you run into that, and what do you do with those applications?
Yeah, no, we certainly do. That's a great question. We start by telling them to quantify that because a lot of folks have a feeling that that's the case, and they're certainly busy property owners and managers, and not necessarily capable without that technical advice to be able to quantify that. So that's kind of the first step, and that is why we really enacted the TA program to help quantify what that means. But it's also a legitimate reality the longer the payback is from a technical perspective, because the trick that I was mentioning at the beginning, where you're offering a loan longer than the payback, is a multiplicative function, not to bring up functions again. So if you've got a payback that's a lot longer, well, then you need a loan that's significantly longer, and then you're going to get out of market. You're not going to be able to find that private investment. So that's where the trepidation comes, and I think we're very sympathetic to that. If your payback is only 2 years, well, you have a lot of options out there. So that's really the point of that analysis, is to figure out where do you fall on that and what options are available. And a big key to that is that there are options to be able to buy down the cost of the project before you even get to that financing level. You think about the incentives that are out there, the grants that are out there, other resources that, just as a marketing purposes, we call these the free resources. We all know here that they're not free. They're coming from a tax base, but the free resources that are available to individuals are significant to buy that down, and that then does bring down the payback associated with whatever remaining you need. So stacking those incentives are incredibly important, and that includes tax incentives as well. So it is a legitimate fear that a lot of folks have as they get that quantified and they look at a very long payback, what's out there in the market available. The example I was giving where we did a 10-year loan with a 30-year amortization, though, is something that's available in the market. That's something that a bank was interested in doing. And clearly it does leave what they call a balloon risk at the end. You have to be able to refinance that after the end of 10 years, but come back to the same people that gave it to you in the first place and get another 10-year, 30-year amortization. So there's options that are out there even when you have that long payback.
Okay, thank you. And then Mr. Falvey, I don't know if you're still on. Oh, he's on. Okay.
I'm still here, yes.
Okay, our slide isn't there you go. We couldn't see you. Everybody else could, but we couldn't.
I'm still here, whether you can see me or not. So.
Okay, great, thanks. So you have a reimbursement grant, right? So what do people do in terms of they have to pay the money up front to get a project going? Do you work with them in terms of short-term financing, something like that?
So that's a great question, because that is, another one of those challenges, that the program runs into, where we don't currently provide, any funding up front. So we're not able to help the property get an energy auditor or an engineer in there to evaluate their projects, to understand what their scope of work is, to then understand, what the impacts financially, what that budget would be. Under our GHGRP program, we're considering that. We're considering being able to do that. One of the challenges that we have with our GHGRP program is that it's a very small funding amount. It's $5 million a year. And that's one of the reasons why we have the restrictions that we have at the $15,000 per unit and the $1.25 million per project, because some of these properties, these large properties, central systems, they could take that whole entire budget in one project. And so we've had to be, I think, mindful and I hope thoughtful in trying to get funds into those projects. But we don't currently do upfront funding. That said, the department is always looking for other resources, through the CSNA. All state agencies are required to seek out and apply for all available federal funding that are geared towards the state achieving its goals. And we do have an application in now, I think it is with DOE, where one of the thoughts that we would use that funding for would be to pay for those upfront costs, or at least a portion of those upfront costs. Again, the unfortunate part is the funding amount is not very much. We're only talking, I want to say it's less than $500,000 per year over a 9-year period. But, it is some kind of funding, that we don't currently have available, because again, it is a need. It's important for a lot of these properties to be able to have that funding up front to even just understand what it is they have to do.
So do most people in that situation rely on just traditional lending?
So they either rely on traditional lending, or in a lot of the cases of the projects that the program funds, and when I say the program funds, I mean funds as a whole. So those projects are what we call retrofit projects. They come in and they use pretty much just program funds to do their scope of work, or they will use their reserves for replacements, or the owner will have some other funding source to be able to make a payment. With those projects, oftentimes they're paying for those costs up front, but then we can reimburse a part of that, once they actually go through with the project and they get that grant. We will include some of the costs in that grant.
Okay.
So they still have to put the money out up front, but they'll get some of it back.
Okay, thank you. Last question for me, Ms. Price. Is there a how do building owners find out about the project, your resources, and is there a screening that happens for your resources? And I have a follow-up, but
It's been ad hoc over the past year. Like, so much of it was first just doing like informal interviews. What do you need? What are you concerned about? And yeah, I'm not sure if that's the answer you want, but it's been a lot of recently MDE, who's the regulator at the state level, and me, and we go in with a, I don't know, 1-2 punch, and we're doing a lot of these dog and pony shows, and kind of just ginning up support or awareness, and then I will kind of, you know, create a formalized website and think a bit more kind of strategically moving forward. But yeah, it's just been a lot of, okay, go to events, here we are, yeah.
Okay, and then the follow-up then is, once our regs are approved and the state regs are approved, there will, I would assume, be significant demand for your resources, and so you'll have to build capacity. And what is the plan for building capacity for you?
So Scott mentioned a grant that was a interagency grant. So it was DHCD, MDE, MEA, MCEC, so it was and DGS. So sorry for the acronym soup, but a coalition of us agencies put forth an application for $20 million over 9 years, and it was to build up internal capacity. So my portion of that, 20 divided by 5, so $4 million over 9 years. Again, that's like couch cushions, but it is still, it's a seed, and that would allow me to have kind of a contractor to help build up resources or staff to help, you know, do this en masse. So that's one piece of it. We were working on our fiscal year 26 budget over at the agency and thinking through, okay, like this is a priority for the state and then by proxy for us. So how can we think about using our CEF funding, so the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, which is primarily how MEA is funded. How can we carve some of that money out for this initiative so we can do this en masse? Like the work is never going to be done or full, you know, I could do this for the next 50 years. So that'll kind of help me ramp up.
And I think that this is a critical piece of the puzzle, is getting that technical support to owners. And I guess the other thing is that very often, and I say this all the time, we have really great resources, but only a small sliver of people know about them. And the same people keep getting resources and leaving a lot of people just, by the time they're aware of it, the money's run out, or you've got a 5-year waiting list or something like that. So I think it's really critical, as this is rolled out, that we think about just the equitable distribution of resources.
Yeah. A lot of folks I talk to don't even know MEA exists. So part of that is like being the loudspeaker and getting them over to Eric's team's programs. Hey, apply for the Commercial, Industrial, and Agricultural Grant. We have millions of dollars each year, and we get the same applicants every year. We're always trying to think about how to reach different corners of the state, Garrett County, you know, Washington County, et cetera. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Eric, did you have something?
No, I was just going to add, Becky touched briefly on we're in the process of our fiscal year preparing, just like many state agencies, preparing our fiscal year 26 budget. But in the interim, we actually are actively recruiting for additional team members on our buildings team to help get the word out, as well as to help, get through the hurdles that building owners run into. And we are, deeply committed to the hub and, aligning the resources. I think it's really important that we have the connectivity to those who can help us get the word out as well. So we would be delighted to work with anyone on the county's team to help, bring property owners and managers and operators to the table who we haven't talked to in the past. We want to talk to them.
Great. Super. Count us in. Thanks.
Yeah, so just picking up on that point, Mr. Morrell.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to add something quickly to your first question there. We see a lot of times that incentives are retroactively applied to projects and people do not want to spend money, just as Scott was mentioning. As a green bank, we would bridge those every day. It's taking the credit risk of Maryland. It's taking the credit risk of Montgomery County, utility incentives, grants, happy to upfront those. I think the bigger question is how do you just make sure that people are going to move forward with projects? And, when we can control for that, we provide bridge financing. It can be short-term, it can be long-term, it can be forgivable if for some real reason that a project falls apart. And any financial institution, like I said, should be willing to do that. So that shouldn't be an impediment from our view of people that are looking at incentives out there, because there are good programs that may pay retroactively.
Yeah, Councilmember Braylor.
Keith, could we please, just wanted to show our cost of capital as we're kind of getting into the kind of the middle of it here. Yeah, it'll be like 10 slides down. Next one there. So as you're thinking about what are the resources that are available, there's a blog on our website called Pricing for LPO Financing. And it shows how the all-in interest rate for an LPO loan, based on the credit rating of the project. So if you had a portfolio of projects that, you have to try to figure out in advance, like where would that land on that schedule of credit ratings? Is it a double B? But if you had a portfolio of projects, one of the nice things about the Loan Programs Office is there's a $100 million minimum. There isn't a maximum. So you could assemble a very, this is financing that can be very broadly available. And you can kind of eyeball different costs of capital there to try to figure out how it might be worth it. And it takes, over a year to go through our process. And then we'll only lend to, at the maximum, 80% of the cost of the project. So there has to be other sources of capital. Could be government, it could be private sector, could be even philanthropic. And you could absolutely, come in for a portfolio that finances individual building owners, then apply to that fund. So you create the availability, and then individual building owners can come in and come out of that. And then our maximum term is 30 years, or 90% of the life of the assets of the project. So it's possible that we can allow for a longer payback, which can really reduce the monthly cost for the borrower.
Very helpful, and I appreciate Councilmember Balcom noting the need for this conversation, not only here at the council to inform this body, but for stakeholders who are watching this, who are here in person, who have contacted us, and those who do not yet know about this legislation, the regulation, and the availability to help make it happen. And so we will, I'll talk with both of you and all of you about maybe taking this in a more public way outside of the chamber to let those communities who are watching this and those who have not yet learned about it know about the resources that we, government at all levels, are providing. Vice President Stewart.
Great. Thank you to the chair for pulling this together, and everyone. This has been a great session, as has the prior ones as well. As the chair started today and talked about, I think all three of us have had a lot of meetings and conversations. We've heard people's concerns about, resources, having them. We've heard Ms. Worthington, as you talked about, as having small multifamily buildings that don't have the staff who are looking at these things, or condo owners and common ownership. So I think today, the options that each of you have laid out to think about is really important. And I also want to just say that summer was a good time to really have these some in-depth conversations and to think about these things and to step back about what our goals need to be as we are looking at putting these regulations into place. And knowing that with our Department of Environmental Protection and talking to them, talking to folks in the community, there is anxiety about this. I mean, right now, what we're looking at in our county, in our state, in our country, with the economics situation, there is anxiety. And what I've been telling to folks, and I know our Department of Environmental Protection feels strongly about, is that we're going to meet our goals and move forward with collaboration and partnership. And I think having this panel today moves that forward as well. The other things we need are not only collaboration, but we need clarity and certainty. Because we know these are building owners. They're people who live in common ownership condo buildings. And they want to know, okay, how are we going to get here? What are the benchmarks we have? How are we going to get here? And how are we going to work together to do that? And we've talked a lot about those things. I know the department is putting out a new report on benchmarks coming soon. And we know we have a number of buildings that are already meeting what the benchmarks could be and the progress that has been made in large part because of the Green Bank and the excellent examples you have provided us. So I think we need to, as the chair said, communicate more to people to make sure they understand, what is in place, what are we looking at, and how we're going to do it all together. Because I think it's having that certainty, the clarity, and the collaboration that is going to help us move forward. So with that, I do agree with Councilmember Balcom about a number of things of getting this out there, and I'm glad to hear about the hub. And Ms. Price, I know you're kind of revving up. You're spending a lot of time listening, which is great. Same thing we're doing. Do you have a kind of a timeline, though, that you're looking at how things are, like when you think you're going to be like able to be at the place where you're distributing materials, connecting people, and I know you're doing some of that already, but
yeah. Like I say it's been soft launched.
Yeah.
And again, doing a lot of these ad hoc engagements and such. January 1st. So things are starting to get moving. But yeah, it was a slower ramp up than I wanted, but that's just the nature of things.
Can you clarify? I'm sorry. Can you clarify what's starting on January 1st?
I think I'll be in a better position to actually start producing resources. The big thrust has been getting a separate website up, so it's like, okay, this is bigger than MEA. This is resources from all different entities, and that's kind of, I think of that as sort of the crown jewel, like where folks go, and then
Great. So maybe thinking January 1st, we're talking to people, there's going to be something that we can say, you can go to this hub.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why I was excited to be on this panel. It's
Yes.
sort of a free advertisement, if you will. Yeah, so I'll follow up with my information, and I'm happy to do one-on-one conversations and give me feedback. What ideas do you have?
No, I think that'll be great to have that and know that it's coming. And, it's coming in January, which is going to be here before we all know it.
We say winter.
Yeah, okay. We'll say winter. That's good. But I think as we were talking about, really, because we have heard from people, like, where can we go for all these things? And so, Mr. Arrow, my question for you is, what else do you need, and does the Green Bank need to do the work, but also to think about how we can be more proactive and reaching out to the community as we're talking about the regulations. Because going to Councilmember Balcom's point, I know from the meetings I've done with you and other team members from the Green Bank, the folks who know about you, who've worked with you, sing the praises and are very thankful. But there are so many people who don't know about the resources or the programs. So what do you need to help the Green Bank?
To leverage what Julie had really said, and I think many people said, we need the regulations in place. You know, it's not a communications issue. We can try and get to a larger audience, and I think that there are strategies that we should be employing, perhaps leveraging your offices more to get out what our materials are. We have materials on our TA program. We have materials on our financing that we provide, and we have these lovely case studies like the one I talked to that are up on our website in brochure form that we can share with people. And we would love to do some of those events. But at the end of the day, you can tell an audience this makes economic sense for you and it makes environmental sense, and they still may not be able to move forward with it. And so I think that this is a communications challenge that we do need to rise to, and we're more than willing to. However, it's going to reach a limit unless the regulations are in place. We experienced this over the last couple of years as we knew BEPS was coming, and people said, okay, well, let me know what the regulation is. And until then, I'm not necessarily going to move forward, even though you're showing me an economically positive scenario with financing or without it. And they're rational actors for doing that because there's so many other things going on. I have a lot of sympathy with that result. But I actually think that the biggest benefit to getting the word out there is going to be to get these regulations in place.
Great. Another question for you is, I think it was Mr. Falvey who, or someone spoke about the heavy ups, you know, when we have to get the utility companies involved and other things. Do you have an example, and it could be today or other days, because that is something we hear from folks, like, oh, if we have to change all these systems, this is a really big project. Has the Green Bank done something that you would be considered in this category of a heavy up?
Yeah, we have had many of renewable energy projects that require heavy ups, and it's been no issue. It's part of the project cost that we can finance and ultimately can support. The bigger issue that we encounter on the renewable energy side is the interconnection costs that will come. Unfortunately, the last person that triggers an increase to the interconnection is the one that has to pay for it currently, which is not a great way to do it in my view. And that results in that specific project hitting a lot of barriers. And sometimes that will even throw the economics beyond what we could do with a 0% interest rate out there. So that's the bigger challenge that we see on the renewable energy side, are those interconnection. In terms of the upgrades to a property itself, that may be a heavy up, maybe other types of electrical work, that's part and parcel of the projects that we fund, and it gets factored into the economics, and they don't really throw off the economics of those projects.
Great. Did you want to
Yeah,
jump up?
Ms. Crowley
Yeah.
from DEP wants to weigh in on the communication, I think.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I think it's just helpful to provide some context about, you know, as the department poised to implement the law, what we have in place, the staff we have in place, and what we've already been doing around this. So in addition to myself, we have 4 staff members. Louis behind me, he's our senior engineer. We have someone working on multifamily outreach, kind of data behind the scenes when it comes to benchmarking, and then we have an admin. So over the past several years, as benchmarking has come into play, we've had an over 90% compliance rate with benchmarking. And so in the process of people kind of taking the first step to benchmark, to understand where they are today, unlike some other laws, this is a real kind of known group of building owners, right? There's 1,800-ish buildings in the county that are covered by this law. So, you know, through the course of working with them, having them comply with we have a help desk at the department that, you know, every day we're helping people kind of understand these first steps. I would say that within DEP, we're also poised to really keep helping people as they take the next step. So to Steve's point, as soon as we kind of know exactly what we're doing, and of course we've been doing a ton of outreach when it comes to BEPS. We will continue with that. Just a few other things that we've been providing. So every year after building owners benchmark, we provide a scorecard back to them to help to contextualize their energy performance. Now, again, as soon as we have more information about this is the standard that you need to get to, we'll be providing that information as well. So really make it clear for people there is a lot of anxiety, where do I fall, where do I land compared to these standards? That's really the next thing on our plate is, we know where you are, and now we can tell you where you need to be. We do an annual energy summit. So over the past couple of years, we've been starting to integrate BEPS requirements into our energy summit. So that's been a key way that we get information out there. And yeah, the scorecards that we send also have resources like to the Green Bank, like to the Empower programs. So, again, we have these regular touch points with building owners. And I, just didn't want it to let it go unsaid that, it's not like the state is the only people or the only department that can help building owners along the way. I guess one other thing that hasn't come up today is the energy efficient buildings property tax credit. So that's another, I guess, incentive available today, and that's specific to the county. So that's for new and existing buildings. For existing buildings, you can receive up to 100% property tax credit, county property tax credit, if you implement an energy improvement measure and then demonstrate an improvement in your energy performance. So again, we've seen a couple applications starting to come through, but definitely room to, get more folks taking advantage of that, and just another tool in the tool belt as far as stacking and layering all these things that are available. And thank you for letting me
Great.
pop up.
No, thank you. And I think, you're going to have, with the next benchmark report, there's going to be an online tool released as well?
Yeah, so within the next couple weeks, there's two things that we're going to be releasing. So every year, part of the law is that we do have an annual disclosure requirement. To date, that's been a little bit maybe hard to parse, like a spreadsheet, and so I'm sure Julie's company and others that are kind of in the know on this have looked at that. But this energy map is going to be a lot kind of easier to visualize, nice public-facing tool to show for every building covered by this law, what's their compliance status, what's their latest performance, and then right now we're planning what's their projected site energy use intensity standard until we have some more finality on that. And then for each building, they'll also have a target lookup tool. So same thing, give just more visibility into what's your current performance, what's going into that baseline that we're calculating for you, and then what's your interim and final standard. So we're really excited. We think it's going to, just bring the temperature down a little. If, your building is already looking pretty good, you can turn to other things or do a little bit of work and get there, or start planning, right? I think that's the key to all of this is, there's people ready to help, just got to get started, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So just 2 points. One, the contractor community, I think, is a fantastic resource to get out there. So we're the folks that are down in the trenches. We have the relationships with the facilities folks. We call on them. We have service agreements on their existing mechanical equipment. We have relationships there, and we know those folks really well. So we are a great resource to get all of these messages across. The other thing that I would say is in terms of the financial burden that building owners are worried about HVAC is obviously a huge, usually over half the utility bill, so we're a big part of the problem, but we can be a big part of the solution. But mechanical equipment is not like windows, right? So windows in a building, if you want, you can leave the same windows for however many years. They might get really drafty and they contribute to energy inefficiency, but you don't necessarily have to replace them on a regular basis. HVAC equipment has to be replaced on a regular basis anyway. So these building owners, I understand that is a significant cost, but BEPS is not requiring them on the HVAC side. It's not requiring them to do something that they don't have to do anyway, right? So that baseline investment has to be there every, per ASHRAE, a piece of, it's different lifespans for a different piece of equipment, but ranging from, 15 to 30 years, 20 being the average. So, the timelines that you guys have on these laws are good because these replacements have to happen anyway. But what we see is when people wait, when they don't have a plan, they have to replace something because it fails tomorrow, they replace it with like for like, and that's what I think that BEPS will hopefully remedy is people are going to have to create a plan. They're going to have to figure out how to do this. And if it's done, and that's how it can be done very affordably, so that's it.
If I may add, Maryland Energy Administration, one of the things we do is we provide financial incentives and assistance to get projects done. And while our resources are significant, they're not infinite. We are looking to work towards those projects can be examples for others. Talked a lot about different buildings. So our commercial, industrial, and agriculture program provides grants to offset a significant portion of the costs of many of these types of projects. And the more savings you get, it's structured, the more savings you get, the greater the incentive, so that we can get deeper energy savings projects. And we also have the Jane Lawton Loan Program, which can help, and it's very more of it's supplemental to the work done by Montgomery County Green Bank, the Maryland Clean Energy Center, but it's for many of those projects it wouldn't fit into other types of financing. And then third, and coming up in the very near future, is part of Governor Moore's $90 million climate down payment is $50 million over spread over 2 years to be able to address electrification of multifamily and community-facing buildings. So we have a number of resources coming towards the sector, emphasis on equity, underserved and overburdened communities, but we would love to continue the dialogue of the kinds of projects and interested parties who may want to take advantage of those resources, so we can get progress and examples that can be used to demonstrate what can be done to others.
Yeah. Just my final point, Julie, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing in the health aspect of this. I raised it on one of the other panels before. I think we might hear some of this next week when we do the faith one. But we focus a lot on moving towards energy efficiency, electrification, and in these conversations, we do have to also make sure that we're talking about people's health, especially in our multifamily buildings. Last week, I got to go and do some NO2 testing in the buildings, and having gas stoves without proper ventilation is a real problem for many of our older buildings. So as we're thinking about moving towards this and our climate goals and why we're doing this, the health impacts of having healthy homes for our residents is really important. I just want to say thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Vice President Stewart. Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk briefly about this. We've come full circle now. We're back to the last mile, right, in terms of the connection and the burden. And I think it's really important to look at it's the last person who triggers an increased capacity of an upgrade or the full burden of the upgrade. We see that in the sewer discussion all the time, and that's just a really heavy cost. And so it's interesting, you just mentioned the $50 million investment and whether part of that can be used in this upgrade. But I think we need to be proactive about looking at which buildings are going to be doing this at the same time and not get into the situation where, some poor sap who was the last one in has an oversized cost. So I think that's something that we need to look at, that perhaps, DEP can participate in. So just want to make that point.
Thank you for elevating that, and Vice President Stewart, for your comments. We have heard from common ownership communities about either the master metering problem or the electrical upgrade problem, and so the points that you raised are spot on. I'll also add, picking up on what Ms. Curley said about this conversation and the information provided to bring the temperature down. The whole goal is to bring the temperature of the planet down, right? And this conversation needs to be broadened. So we will, as a committee, figure out how we can do that. I do want to say, because I don't think Mr. Morell said it, the Green Bank does do public conversations a few times a year, quarterly or at least a few times a year. And so a lot of common ownership communities and single-family homeowners are learning about it and utilizing their services there. But at the end of the day, to reiterate, nobody who has come before this committee or engaged in this conversation has questioned the underlying legislation. Really important to note. People have raised questions about how to get there. And this discussion hopefully will provide a further roadmap for how we as a local jurisdiction can utilize local, state, and federal resources, combine them however legally possible. If not legally possible, we can try to create legal avenues with partners at the state level to maximize all of these efforts, because we need to do it. And so thank you, colleagues. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today in person and virtually. As noted earlier, we will have one more conversation next week, next Monday, which is Monday, September 23rd at 1:30. That will be a conversation with our faith community so that they can help share with us their thoughts on how to make this a reality as well. Another underutilized members of our community. So with that, thank you all. Good to see you again, Councilmember Reamer. And with that, this committee is adjourned.